I'm Lindsay Hall.
And I'm Esther Wielden.
Welcome to All Things Sustainable, a podcast from S&P Global. As your hosts, we'll dive into all the sustainability topics that are reshaping the business world.
Join us every Friday for in-depth analysis and interviews with leaders from around the globe. Together, we'll break down big sustainability headlines and cut through the jargon.
Five years ago, the Prince of Wales launched an organization called the Sustainable Markets Initiative, or SMI. The Prince of Wales is, of course, now His Majesty King Charles III, and the organization earlier this year celebrated its 5-year anniversary. Today, we're bringing you the latest episode of the Terra Carta Series of the All Things Sustainable podcast, a collaboration with the Sustainable Markets Initiative. Throughout this year, we'll be interviewing SMI member CEOs about how they're approaching sustainability challenges and opportunities. A bit of background about this organization. The SMI is a network of over 250 global CEOs across finance and industry, and S&P Global is a member. SMI facilitates private sector diplomacy with the ambition of making sustainability the driving force of global markets and value creation. And we're calling this the Terra Carta series based on SMI's Terra Carta mandate. This is the guiding mandate for the SMI that sets out ambitious, practical actions to help the private sector accelerate progress toward a sustainable future. The name Terra Carta is a play on the historic Magna Carta.
SMI members include companies of all sizes, from some of the world's largest financial institutions to today's guest, a San Francisco and London-based climate tech company founded in 2020. That company is called Patch, and today we're talking with its co-founder and CEO, Brennan Spellacy. Patch helps organizations manage, sell, and buy carbon credits. And as a refresher, carbon markets are trading systems where carbon credits can be bought and sold to offset emissions. Countries and companies can use them to lower their carbon emissions by purchasing carbon credits for projects designed to remove, avoid, or reduce emissions. As we'll hear today, interest in these markets is growing. Brennan talks about what's driving this trend, the challenges companies face in navigating complex carbon markets, and how Patch is working to solve these problems. Before we turn to the interview, a quick primer on some terms you'll hear today. So there are generally two large categories of carbon credits. The first type is avoidance credits that avoid emitting carbon completely. And the second category is carbon removal credits. Those are for projects that remove carbon directly from the atmosphere and store it somewhere. Brennan sometimes refers to this second category of credits as pure removals or 100% removals. Okay, here's Brennan, who starts off by describing what Patch does and some of the technologies it helps companies invest in.
At Patch, our vision and mission is to accelerate climate solutions with integrity. So the way we do that is we partner with some of the largest companies in the world. Think organizations like Workday, think organizations like Bain & Company, to help them build and execute their carbon credit strategies. So at Patch, we very much have the perspective that we need all of the solutions as soon as possible when it comes to mitigating the climate crisis. What we focus our energy on is different pathways that either abate emissions or prevent emissions from happening in the first place. Typically, you'll hear this as carbon reductions or carbon avoidance if you're operating within the carbon market, or things like carbon removal, which is all about taking CO2 out of the carbon cycle and storing it. So when you look at the wide variety of solutions on the Patch platform, we're really aiming to be a window to the market. So we partner with hundreds of organizations globally that produce all these different solutions. And what that enables us to do is be this trusted advisor, this unbiased party to essentially consult and advise with our enterprise partners to help them understand how they should be deploying their budgets and what their expectations or desires should be of their portfolio mix. So what that results in is a huge gambit of ways to take CO2 out of the air and avoid emissions. So there are things as potentially as not flashy as things like methane destruction. So there are huge sources of methane that are currently unregulated and emitting into the atmosphere today. Methane has over 25 times the global heating potential of carbon dioxide, and yet in many cases, it's actually unregulated, particularly outside of the Western world. We have project developers at Patch that'll actually go and find those sources of methane, either flare the methane, capture it, or do something else with it. That's preventing an emission from happening. those types of credits, those types of solutions will typically cost somewhere between $15 and $25 US dollars per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. So how much methane can be essentially converted into carbon dioxide. You'll have things called nature-based solutions, which are all about using nature. So whether that's forests or mangroves to suck CO2 out of the air. So we have a huge number of project developers in North America, in Africa, in Asia, and even parts of Europe and Scotland that are either developing new forests, that's called afforestation, or restoring old forests, that's called reforestation, with natural or native species of trees and other forms of woody biomass to take CO2 out of the air. There are other solutions like biochar, which are all about taking waste biomass and essentially finding the pure carbon within it and storing that. And then things more technologically sophisticated like direct air carbon capture, or even solutions like enhanced rock weathering, which takes advantage of that carbonation cycle we were talking about before, taking a mineral like basalt or olivine and having it react with CO2. In a lot of cases, it'll actually be used as an agricultural additive where the rock, the basalt, or the olivine will be sprinkled with as a very fine dust within fields of crops, and it'll be used both as an additive to the soil to help the crop grow better, but it'll also react with the CO2 in the air and store it stably. But the kind of so what, or the thing to take away, is that there are dozens of ways to take CO2 out of the air, and it's incredibly difficult to understand which solution is right for you or which set of solutions are right for you. And the whole idea that we're trying to push, or our theory of change, is if you give these chief executives and CSOs the tools they need and the insight and the transparency and put essentially the entire market in one place at your fingertips, you're able to compare apples to apples and weigh the pros and cons of all these different solutions and help them scale a little bit more quickly.
Patch joined the SMI in 2022, and I asked Brennan about the company's experience. What has he learned from being a member?
The thing that I found incredibly compelling about the SMI was the cross-functional nature that the SMI was taking when it comes to driving climate action. So the composition of the SMI is a series of task forces or hubs that are effectively domain specific. Some focus on aviation, some focused on the built environment, as well as a series of a couple dozen other sectors. The beauty of it is actually how you can combine the learnings across all these different CEOs and CSOs, chief sustainability officers, across these different industries where you think they wouldn't have a huge amount of overlap, and finding commonality in how to think about engaging your supply chain, in our case, engaging carbon dioxide removal as a lever for abating and getting closer to your net zero objectives. So it's really the cross-functional nature that we found incredibly compelling about the SMI that drove us to play a role.
Are there any particular examples of things that have unlocked as a result of those relationships?
So one thing that really stuck out was when you spoke to a series of CEOs, our core focus is carbon dioxide removal and carbon markets broadly. Our core theme we saw across the aviation sector, the banking sector, insurance, was that organizations were spending upwards of 30% of their carbon removal or carbon credit budgets on determining how to deploy those budgets. Incredibly inefficient. In many cases, there was a huge amount of repetitive work that was taking place between some of these large banks, insurance providers, and airlines. And so the kind of core unlock for us, a core insight was, hey, how do we find a way to synthesize a lot of the common questions folks are trying to ask? We were able to kind of fold those learnings also into the core offering that Patch has to essentially enable the democratization of access of all these learnings. Because the common theme that we see within chief executives and CSOs is that there's this desire to go incredibly deep and educate yourself on what the most compelling ways to remove carbon are. But in many cases, there's a huge amount of duplicative work that's taking place. It's incredibly repetitive. And so this kind of 30% figure that I kept on hearing over and over and over again, for some folks, it was 20%. For others, it was a little bit more than 30%. But the whole idea was that there was a huge piece of this budget that was essentially getting wasted at every organization. And at Patch, we were really excited about the idea of exploring how could we maybe minimize some of that waste.
What are some of the priorities or things you're hearing from your clients and what they're looking for, and how might that differ by what sector or what type of company they are?
Well, I think the overarching theme that we're seeing since the last US election is there's a huge kind of split when it comes to not so much by industry, but by geography and what you're operating within. So we're almost living in a tale of two worlds right now, where you have US-based clients or US-based organizations who have been investing tens of millions of dollars into carbon removal, who are now being told by their North American marketing teams, we don't even want the public to know that we have a chief sustainability officer. We want to lay low. We don't want to be potentially caught in a rough spot between the current administration and maybe the financial interests of the firm. And so organizations are starting to kind of fall into this almost green hushing type mechanism within the United States. The irony, though, is that between the inauguration and now, we've actually seen a 7% uptick when you compare to that period of time in the last period to the year before in carbon credit buyers. And so the question is, well, why is this happening? And the reason is a lot of these CSOs know that there is no credible path to net zero without carbon removal. It does not exist. So what's happening now is while the strategy is staying the same and beginning to get implemented, the tactics to communicate it and execute it are getting changed. I have conversations with CSOs every single week saying, hey, we're still investing in carbon removal. We're still investing in renewables. We're still investing in battery technology or whatever decarbonization pathway fits best to their industry. But we might position it as energy independence or international competitiveness or something related to reindustrialization of the US. And so it's been this really fascinating duality where you have organizations and CSOs continuing to double down on their investment because they have this long-term vision. All these CSOs are planning to be in seat for longer than the current political moment. But at the same time, you have to react to the realities on the ground and make sure that you're positioning your firm or your organization, your employees, your customers in a way that can set them up for success in the short term while not ceding ground for the longer term strategic imperative it is to get to net zero.
Are you hearing at all from them that they're increased focused on the carbon offset side of things is because they may not be able to as aggressively pursue the decarbonization side on their own?
So there's this separate dynamic that was happening before the election, actually, where I was having a conversation with the CSO of a food business during this last New York Climate Week, so before the administration happened in September of 2024. And what they were telling me was that the first 20 and 30% of decarbonization is really easy, actually. You have conversations on Zoom, you do a little bit less business travel, you maybe ensure you have a little bit less waste, financial waste in your system, which typically results in less embedded carbon, of whether that's in food or buildings or whatever it might be, less energy wasted. And it's typically aligned with the CFO because it's typically aligned with minimizing cost. What we're now beginning to see is that the next 20 or 30% of decarbonization is not that it's not possible, it's just that it comes with a lot more risk. And the reason is because that's going to come with large capital expenditures, large CapEx investments that are going to take 3, 4, 5, 6 years to deploy and might not only be in the control of the corporate, but rather rely on external permitting, might rely on macroeconomic factors like interest rates. And so what we're beginning to realize is that the next 20 or 30% of decarbonization is not that it's unclear what you have to do, but there's a huge amount of risk associated with deploying billions of dollars per year in a higher interest rate environment. We now have global trade getting disrupted. And so there's a huge amount of risk in the system. And so what they're beginning to look at is carbon removal, not so much as an or, but rather as an insurance policy that says the slower I decarbonize, the more carbon dioxide removal I'm going to need in the future. And so how do you make sure you're having this dual track sustainable and net zero strategy happening where you're focusing on decarbonization and deploying your CapEx dollars towards renewables, battery, fleet electrification, whatever your industry necessitates, but at the same time, not putting all of your eggs in the plan A basket. You're making sure that you actually have a valid way to act as the pressure release valve, if you will. So it's actually a little bit of both, Esther, where folks need realizing that there's a huge amount of risk in this next 4 or 5 years, while everyone else is also having that realization. And so people are beginning to position themselves to understand, okay, how do I make sure I have access to the carbon removal I'm going to need to make sure I am not caught flat-footed in 2028, 2029, and 2030?
What criteria are you hearing from the companies you're working with for what they're looking for?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we actually, by the time that this comes out, we actually have a data report coming out. And what we see is actually a huge portion of folks coming into patch today in particular are looking for pure removals, actually. So 44% of our buyers that come to patch want 100% removals in their portfolio. But what you realize is 41% of credits are avoidance-based credits. So using those methane-based technologies, nature preservation, things like this. And so what people are beginning to realize is that removals, particularly for the longer term, are a critical component of getting to net zero. But in many cases, avoidance-based credits can't be neglected. And so it's very interesting because in many cases, folks will have this public position of only focusing on removals. But after speaking to the strategy team, after kind of seeing what's out in the market and what's highly rated versus what isn't, after seeing what the budgetary realities of their carbon program are today versus what they will be in the future, you typically end up with a lot more of a balanced approach where you might actually have a 50-50 removals avoidance or 60-40 removals avoidance type split.
When you mention budget realities of today versus future, what are you referring to?
So I'm particularly referring to the price per ton of carbon that an enterprise today can afford. So what you'll see is often organizations, when they haven't had an internal carbon price, so they're not actually actively taxing or systemically budgeting for carbon abatement and carbon removal internally, typically carbon removal will come out of some sort of discretionary budget line item, where maybe a CSO or a CFO will have 100,000, 500, a million, 2 million, whatever it might be, depending on the scale of the organization, that they can use their discretion to allocate year over year. What we're beginning to see now is a new level of sophistication coming to carbon and sustainability budgeting broadly, where the CFO is now beginning to lean in. They're beginning to think in terms of 3, 5, sometimes 10-year operating plans. And what that'll typically come with is what type of carbon price, essentially, internally, can our business, can our cost structure support today? And what can it support tomorrow? And typically, the most common shape we'll see is a carbon price will start on the lower side, think $20, $30, $40 US dollars per ton in the short term. And then it will scale up to somewhere around $80 to $100 by 2030, sometimes the mid 2030s, so 2035. And the reason for that is, one, they've historically not paid for this in the short term. So they need to ideally start with a lower price and kind of build the organizational resilience and rigor and budgeting pools for it in the short term. But then two, organizations should be decarbonizing. So their total emission pool should be going down, even if budgets in the future are going up. And if that's what's happening, you end up with this interesting numerator denominator effect where the total number of tons that you actually have to compensate for ideally should be either staying constant or decreasing, but the total budget you can allocate towards that problem should be going up over time. And so when I say budgetary realities, typically what's happening is folks are at the beginning of their journey. They might only have the budget for $15, $20, $30 per ton. And so typically what will happen is it'll come down to what kind of claim they've made. Are they trying to be net zero or carbon neutral today? In that case, then you are essentially pigeonholed into just paying that 25, 30, or whatever that lower price per ton that you can afford is. Or what we typically have to try to push clients towards, if their strategy can support that, is more of a contribution model. So instead of saying the total footprint of my business is 100,000 tons and I have $1 million to spend, so I can only deploy $10 per ton, we say, hey, you have $1 million to spend. That's amazing. You don't have to be net zero today. So how do we come up with the most compelling, values aligned, supply chain aligned way to deploy that $1 million, even if you don't get that full 100,000 tons? You don't have to be net zero today. You have to be net zero by 2030 or 2035 or 2040, depending on what the strategy actually is. And so the idea is, how do you fit within the budgetary realities, but as well as the longer term strategy of the firm to deploy that capital in the most responsible and kind of long term thinking way possible?
What drives companies to want to have 100% removals first? Is it a concern about confidence in the market? Kind of what is the underlying incentives usually for them for that?
That's a great question. So the drive for removals is a highly debated or fraught discussion within the carbon market ecosystem broadly. There's typically 2 or 3 reasons organizations will come to Patch wondering why should we be doing 100% removals. In some cases, it's simply because that's what their peer set is doing, and therefore, if they're a fast follower or a late adopter, they'll typically be following the strategy of their peer set. But the folks who are at the more tip end of their spear typically have a slightly more nuanced approach, but it really comes down to the fact that certain avoidance projects historically have effectively relied on what's called a counterfactual. So most typically, in the context of renewable energy development projects or prevented deforestation projects, it's all about, does that carbon finance or climate finance prevent something that would have caused environmental degradation from happening? So when you look at a reforestation project, you'll typically have essentially a forest that you're attempting to protect, and the climate finance is meant to prevent the deforestation of that. But what's very difficult to ascertain at times is, well, would that deforestation have happened at all, or was climate finance required? In many cases, this broad category of credit has been essentially tarnished by the difficulty of this problem. And so as a result, the quote unquote easier way to solve this issue is to go to removals. It's much easier to directly link the carbon finance or climate finance to the action being taken. But the core reason people are so focused on removals en masse out of the gate or when they first come to Patch is because they don't have a framework to think about avoidance-based credits, and removal typically seems a little bit easier. And then once you have a couple early movers that have that framework out in the open, it creates this groundswell. And there's this almost surround sound effect where everyone's looking at what the market leaders are doing, everyone's doing removals, and then they go towards that.
So, how do you aim to scale up finance then?
So the core theory of change at Patch is that it's incredibly difficult to understand this market. And the way we're going to drive scaling within this ecosystem today is to remove the friction to understanding. So before Patch, if you were to go out and try to build a carbon program, you would typically have to work with perhaps a management consultant or build a capability in-house to develop a strategy. You would then have to reach out to a series of brokers or other project developers to understand what their pricing and inventory availability is. Typically, they don't disclose what their margins are. They don't disclose what pricing they've offered other customers. And in a lot of cases, they don't even provide you with complete diligence data to understand what is the thing I'm buying and is it having the impact it ought to have. And then finally, post-transaction, you're left with this non-tangible asset in a carbon credit, which is essentially a digital representation of climate impact. And in many cases, the operations of understanding the status of your credits, where they are, how they had the impact they have. If not, what is your recourse? You essentially have to do that all yourself. What we do at Patch is we solve all those problems for you, where we help you understand what you ought to do. We put the entire market at your footprints in a software platform. We use AI to comb through hundreds of thousands of PDFs and spreadsheets to diligence technology for you. And then we actually kind of provide you this one-stop shop to manage your entire portfolio holistically. A lot of times when we speak to organizations, the reason they're not deploying faster, or in some cases deploying at all, is because doing the right thing, deploying capital into these markets is too hard. And it's not that they're not forced to, it's not that their stakeholders, their employees, their investors, their customers don't want them to do it. It's that it's simply too specialized, feels too high risk. You're too exposed in a lot of cases to actually deploy capital here if you were to do it on your own. And it's very hard to become truly capable here without a fairly large team. The one true organization that's deploying really meaningfully in carbon removal, it's Microsoft. Microsoft's carbon procurement team is 30 people. So they have 30 dedicated full-time employees doing diligence, sourcing volume, negotiating contracts, solving all these core problems I was describing. Most organizations are lucky if their whole sustainability team is 30 people. In a lot of cases, even some of Patch's largest enterprise clients have teams of 2 or 3. And so it's not viable to expect every enterprise to have 30, 40 people dedicated to this problem just on carbon removal, not even a sustainability. And so for us, the whole idea is, how do you make it incredibly easy to deploy capital here? And when you reduce the friction level, the activation energy to participate, we've seen growth happen. And so that's really what we're maniacally focused on, is how do we make it incredibly easy to stay compliant, access a volume at a competitive rate, and truly understand, what are you buying?
Brennan went on to outline how Patch is helping to increase the integrity of carbon markets.
So the core idea behind driving integrity within this market really comes down to data access and then data interpretation or synthesis. And so what we do at Patch is we have a team of climate scientists that actually define what does a high integrity carbon credit look like based off of all of the existing market signals today. What we are not trying to do is we're not trying to be a credit rating firm. We're not trying to be a verifier at Patch. What we do is we collect all the data points within the market and create essentially a holistic framework to evaluate different technology types and enable buyers to compare them apples to apples. Because right now it's very hard to compare a direct air carbon capture facility to a reforestation project. The chemistry is different, the durability is different, the what are called co-benefits, so non-climate change related benefits are different. And so for the average buyer, it's incredibly difficult to understand what's happening. What we do at Patch is we take all of these documents that these projects produce and we run them through an AI model and map them to that framework, that universal framework. And what that enables us to do is essentially do the work of around 100 or 200 scientists with a team of 10 scientists. And we're able to actually give these scientists these tools to present to buyers in a digestible way. These are all the strengths and risks associated with a particular project type or a particular project. And then what that enables buyers to do is take a calculated risk based off of the profile of their business. Because the reality is that whether, again, you're looking at methane abatement or reforestation or direct air carbon capture, whenever you're trying to scale chemistry, so hundreds of millions of reactions, of processes, of hundreds of millions of tons, there are going to be things that go wrong. So there is no riskless carbon credit. The real question is just all about what types of risks are buyers okay with? Is it risk of non-delivery? Is it risk of leakage? Is it risk of maybe there's a better price somewhere else that they're not aware of? It's all about just understanding what types of risks organizations are prepared to take on. And then how do you manage those risks? And so typically that's why we encourage organizations not to go all in on one project or one technology, but rather the average portfolio Patch typically is composed of 10 to 15 solutions. And the whole idea is if you diversify your risk across a lot of different types of risks and technologies, you're able to put yourself in a position where you're not stuck in the future.
Now, what challenges are you facing given the changing political and geopolitical landscape?
Yes, I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is organizations, when it comes to sustainability, in many cases, there are some early adopters to the tip of the spear, but most fairly resource-constrained organizations are struggling to figure out what an amazing carbon or sustainability program generally looks like. And there are some organizations that Patch works with in particular that are doing amazing work, but they are not prepared to talk about that work publicly, or at least not through the lens of mitigating the climate crisis. And again, the reason for that is whether it's fear of losing customers, maybe they sell to the government, fear of retribution, whatever it might be. And so the core headwind we're facing is the idea that folks are not prepared to cross-pollinate on best practices in the industry. The reality is that these chief executives, these CSOs, these CFOs, they're also people. They rely on their peer networks. They rely on their peer sets to understand what best practices are beginning to develop within the market. And the current environment we're operating within, there is essentially a restriction of flow of information. And so at Patch, what we're trying to do is we're trying to play that pairing game where we're trying to help existing CSOs who do nothing or maybe are beginning to think about carbon removal, talk to CSOs that have been doing it for a couple of years now. But it's, again, adding friction to the system. It's slowing things down. It's not actually changing strategies, the current political environment, but it is changing the tactics on the ground, which as a result is adding friction to the system and slowing adoption.
Honestly, I think that is the most clear explanation I've heard yet of it, because I've been trying to get my head around they're still being active. We're hearing that they're still working towards these plans. So then why is it slowing down? And you're saying it's partly because of this dampening of discussion, of public discourse.
That's exactly right. Right. Like when you think about collaboration within a company, it's something we think about a lot at Patch. We're a hybrid organization. We have a couple people, we have around 30 people, 40 people in offices, the rest are remote. Typically, when I find some sort of pocket of Patch that's been less effective, it's because communication flow has been hampered. Not because the team has become less competent, not because there's malintent or not even because there's a misalignment of incentives, but simply the right people are not talking at the right time. And it adds drag to the system. And I don't view it any differently as whether it's an industry or a broader movement trying to make progress in a particular direction. When you impede information flow, decision velocity goes down. And when decision velocity goes down, progress goes out the door. Fewer mistakes are made, which means there's less learning. Fewer mistakes are then documented and communicated, which means, again, there's less learning again. Almost becomes this, again, it's never stopping anything because, again, the intent and the strategy is still there. It's just it's like working your way through molasses. You almost have to be like a private investigator if you're a CSO, try to find a peer that'll talk to you about a particular problem. And a couple of years ago, it would be much easier to find that because you could simply Google, high integrity carbon credit action, and you'd find a bunch of headlines about organizations taking action, and you can say, okay, great, I know Microsoft's doing something. I'm going to go reach out to the CSO of Microsoft and see how she's thinking about things. There are a few people who are still vocal today, but they're becoming far and fewer between.
So let's turn towards sort of lessons you've learned as a CEO. What advice would you give to someone who's aspiring to become a CEO?
I found a patch 5 years ago, and I've been working for a couple other startups before that. And, I think while I've learned a lot of lessons, I'm always kind of hesitant to give advice. I think it's really domain and situation specific. But a few things that I personally have learned that I almost have to consistently repeat to myself is the first and foremost is every employee, customer, investor has a lot going on in their lives. There's a huge amount of a person. You don't see it at any one time. And so the need to repeat what's important, your key messages, your key value props, your key vision or mission in the case of employees is incredibly important. In most cases, people are thinking 1, 2, 3, 4 days out of the year on your particular problem or domain. And so this need to constantly repeat the key messages is super, super critical. And it applies for employees internally as well, right? Again, they're obviously spending more time on our mission than 3 or 4 days a year. But when you think about where Patch wants to be in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, whatever time horizon you're operating on, they're so caught up in the execution. They're moving incredibly quickly. They're shipping software. They're talking to customers. They're doing marketing campaigns. Sometimes it's easy to lose track of what the North Star is. And this idea of constantly repeating the North Star is super important. And that was something I was, at least for myself, incredibly unintuitive. I thought if I said something once or twice, that ought to be sufficient. And to repeat it either felt like I assumed people weren't listening to me or potentially patronizing for them not understanding what I was talking about. But time and time again, I have always been happier when I've repeated what the most important things are to the company. Every single week, we have a weekly all hands. Every time I repeat it, it always results in better decisions the following week getting made.
Brennan had one message he wanted to reiterate to our listeners.
Given the audience tends to be focused a little bit more on operating in the sustainability domain, I think the thing that I just repeat, and this is something we come back to over and over again, is regardless of the political flavor of the day, the long-term strategy and long-term kind of cycle is kind of in our favor. The mission we're all operating on or working towards always is more important now than it has been. So even though the tactics might evolve in the short term, almost every CSO that I've seen is upping their investments in 25 and 26, not cutting them. But how you deploy and how you talk about that deployment is going to obviously evolve.
Today, we heard how Patch is working to make it easier for companies to invest in carbon credits and be able to make apples-to-apples comparisons of projects. We also heard how the company is leveraging AI technologies to facilitate that analysis. Brennan also said that climate action is being dampened by companies voluntarily holding back on publicly communicating their actions and strategies because it's affecting the peer-to-peer kind of network that's needed. At the same time, he said the long-term direction of travel for the climate-related investments is positive.
And this is a message we're hearing from many of our guests on this podcast in 2025. This idea that they remain committed to their sustainability strategies, even as they rethink the way they're communicating and the language they use. We'll continue to track this trend in interviews with sustainability leaders in future episodes to understand how organizations are navigating this evolving landscape. We'll also be back with upcoming episodes of the Terra Carta Series. We'll include a link in our show notes if you'd like to hear our first episode featuring Sustainable Markets Initiative CEO Jennifer Jordan Seife. We'll also include a link if you'd like to learn more about the upcoming S&P Global Sustainable One Summit taking place in Singapore on June 26th. Please stay tuned as next week we're bringing you a deep dive into everything you need to know about methane emissions and emerging technologies for measuring and mitigating them. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of All Things Sustainable. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.